Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet was born on December 10, 1787, and died on September 10, 1851. The legend says that in 1814, Gallaudet visited his family in Hartford, Connecticut. Out the window, he noticed that his younger brothers and sisters weren't playing with another child. When he went out to investigate, he learned that this young woman, Alice Cogswell, was deaf. He tried communicating with Alice. When she understood him, he was inspired to teach her more. Alice's father, Mason Cogswell, subsequently paid for Thomas's trips to Europe since there were no school for deaf children during that time. He first traveled to England, where he ran into roadblocks with the Braidwood family. They operated many schools for deaf students in England. Their schools made the deaf students master lip reading and speech. They weren't willing to share their methods, since he wasn't able to pay the fees they requested. Yet he wasn't satisfied that their method produced good results. However, while in England, he met Ab Sickard and two of his faculty members, Laurent Clerc and John Massieu, which were highly educated graduates of Ab's Institute. Not much time after, he accompanied them to France to learn from them. He ran out of funds and realized he wasn't ready to set up a school on his own. So he called Clark to accompany him back to America, and together they established the American School for the Deaf in 1817. Charles Michel de Lépée was born on November 24, 1712, and died December 23, 1789. Lépée changed centuries-old mindsets about the fundamental human rights of deaf people by taking on the challenge of systematically working to teach deaf children. Lépée was the son of a wealthy architect who worked directly for King Louis XIV. He could have lived a life of leisure, but instead picked to study theology and law. He met twin girls who had been deaf since birth while living in Paris. He began teaching them hand signals that substituted the sounds of the alphabet. After seeing how successful his method was becoming, he started taking on more and more students that weren't just from wealthy families. His manual alphabet, named French Sign Language, was adapted into American Sign Language a few decades after his death. De Lépée and Gallaudet weren't the only ones responsible for years of success to come. Laurent Clerc was a major contribution to the cause.
Laurent Clerc, a French teacher called the Apostle of the Deaf in America, was born December 26 in Le Bon, France. Clerc attended and later became a teacher at the National Institute, the Georges Sard, in Paris. While he attended this school, he was taught by Abe Sicard and Jean Massieu, who were both deaf. In 1815, Clerc traveled with them to England, where they met Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, who was traveling wanting to instruct deaf children. Gallaudet was invited to the school in Paris. In 1816, after he had spent a few months with Clerc at the school, Gallaudet invited Clerc to accompany him to the United States. Meanwhile, they traveled across the ocean. Clerc was able to learn English from Gallaudet, and Gallaudet learned sign language from Clerc. Once they arrived in America, they worked together to establish the first permanent school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut, now known as the American School for the Deaf. After Gallaudet and Clerc established the School for the Deaf, they continued to promote the advancement of education for deaf students across the states. In 1857, when Edward Miller Gallaudet took up his father's cause because he and his deaf mother were invited by Amos Kendall to run the newly established institution in Washington, D.C., called the Columbia Institution for the Instruction of the Deaf and the Dumb and the Blind. With Kendall's connections and resources, under Gallaudet's youngest son's leadership and vision, the school flourished, expanded, and eventually came to the point where they provided instruction for aspiring teachers for the deaf and to become the world's only institution of higher education made for the deaf and the hard-hearing students. In 1856, Amos Kendall donated 2 acres of his estate to establish a school and housing per 12 deaf and 6 blind students in Washington, D.C. The next year, he persuaded Congress to incorporate the school, called the Columbia Institution for the Instruction of the Dumb and the Deaf and the Blind. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet's son, Edward Minor Gallaudet, became the school's superintendent. Congress authorized the school to hand out college degrees in 1864, with President Abraham Lincoln signing the bill into law, later making the whole institution known as Gallaudet College because of a Congress Act in 1954. Expanded a few years later, making it look as you can see it nowadays.
As the name Gallaudet implies, this university was a community of learning for the deaf, hearing, and hard of hearing students who were looking for an education that prepared them for a career in a bilingual environment. Moreover, it is and was viewed as a primary resource for all things related to the deaf community. Gallaudet University was not the only center of education. It brought a new sign language into play. Although the university mainly taught Old French Sign Language, many signs that the students brought were mixed and incorporated into what is now known as American Sign Language. However, Gallaudet University wasn't the only way Gallaudet's creation spread, right?
I used to call them deaf and dumb. They weren't deaf and dumb, they were just deaf, that's all, because they couldn't speak, so they all, afterwards they call them deaf mutes.
One example of how sign language spread was a peculiar phenomenon named Martha's Vineyard. This wasn't a normal yard of grapes. No, this was a group of deaf people on an island off the coast of Massachusetts, USA. This group of people was especially unique because it had a mass number of deaf people residing on a small island. To put this in perspective, it was estimated in the latter part of the 19th century, every 1 out of 2,730 Americans were born deaf. However, in Martha's Vineyard, it was estimated the rate was closer to 155. Why is this so important? At the time, even with the new form of communicating called sign language, many deaf people were seen as outcasts. However, on this small island, many of the people accepted the deaf and completely changed the social environment as a whole community of deaf people. Whether it was basic tasks such as running errands to having large social gatherings, nobody was mistreated due to their disability. Not only did this change the social norms, but this community of people also improved the research of many scientists studying this disorder. Alexander Graham Bell was born on March 3, 1847. Most famous for his invention, now known as the telephone, is a very important inventor in history. However, did you know he did research on the deaf? He was very passionate on studying this disorder and actively participated in many of the conflicts in between the deaf community. For example, he proved that heredity genes were the cause of many deaf cases. Additionally, he started to question the methods on how people were learning American Sign Language. Therefore, he taught many deaf kids his preferred way of teaching the deaf. This way was called oral teaching. This method taught kids how to read lips and mimic the techniques of many hearing people. While being highly debated against, it proved to be one of the most practical methods of communicating for the deaf.
After many years, it is evident that other people's and Gallaudet's actions have changed the deaf community forever. From that day, when Gallaudet noticed Alice Cogswell not being able to play with other kids, to founding one of the largest deaf schools in the world. The whole world owes him and his partners a big thanks. Now, because of these people and many more, a large majority of the deaf community can socialize with the whole world without hiding.